Passenger to Frankfurt, by Agatha Christie. Read by Hugh, Fraser. Book 1. Interrupted Journey. Chapter 1. Passenger to Frankfurt. Fasten your seatbelts, please. The diverse passengers in the plane were slow to obey. There was a general feeling that they couldn't possibly be arriving at Geneva yet. The drowsy groaned and yawned. The more than drowsy had to be gently roused by an authoritative stewardess. "Your seatbelts, please." The dry voice came authoritatively over the tannoy. It explained in German, in French, and in English that a short period of rough weather would shortly be experienced. Sir Stafford Nye opened his mouth to its full extent, yawned, and pulled himself upright in his seat. He had been dreaming, very happily, of fishing an English river. He was a man of 45, of medium height, with a smooth, olive, clean-shaven face. In dress, he rather liked to affect the bizarre. A man of excellent family, he felt fully at ease indulging any such sartorial whims. If it made the more conventionally dressed of his colleagues wince occasionally, that was merely a source of malicious pleasure to him. There was something about him of the 18th century buck. He liked to be noticed. His particular kind of affectation when travelling was a kind of bandit's cloak, which he had once purchased in Corsica. It was of a very dark purply blue, had a scarlet lining, and had a kind of burnous hanging down behind, which he could draw up over his head when he wished to, so as to obviate draughts. Sir Stafford Nye had been a disappointment in diplomatic circles. Marked out in early youth by his gifts for great things, he had singularly failed to fulfil his early promise. A peculiar and diabolical sense of humour was wont to afflict him in what should have been his most serious moments. When it came to the point, he found that he always preferred to indulge his delicate puckish malice to boring himself. He was a well-known figure in public life, without ever having reached eminence. It was felt that Stafford Nye, though definitely brilliant, was not, and presumably never would be, a safe man. In these days of tangled politics and tangled foreign relations, safety, especially if one were to reach ambassadorial rank, was preferable to brilliance. Sir Stafford Nye was relegated to the shelf, though he was occasionally entrusted with such missions as needed the art of intrigue, but were not of too important or public a nature. Journalists sometimes referred to him as the dark horse of diplomacy. Whether Sir Stafford himself was disappointed with his own career, nobody ever knew, probably not even Sir Stafford himself. He was a man of a certain vanity, but he was also a man who very much enjoyed indulging his own proclivities for mischief. He was returning now from a commission of inquiry in Malaya. He had found it singularly lacking in interest. His colleagues had, in his opinion, made up their minds beforehand what their findings were going to be. They saw, and they listened, but their preconceived views were not affected. Sir Stafford had thrown a few spanners into the works, more for the hell of it than from any pronounced convictions. At all events, he thought, it had livened things up. He wished there were more possibilities of doing that sort of thing. His fellow members of the commission had been sound, dependable fellows, and remarkably dull. Even the well-known Mrs. Nathaniel Edge, the only woman member, well known as having bees in her bonnet, was no fool when it came down to plain facts. She saw, she listened, and she played safe. He had met her before, on the occasion of a problem to be solved in one of the Balkan capitals. It was there that Sir Stafford Nye had not been able to refrain from embarking on a few interesting suggestions. In that scandal-loving periodical, Inside News, it was insinuated that Sir Stafford Nye's presence in that Balkan capital was intimately connected with Balkan problems, and that his mission was a secret one of the greatest delicacy. A kind of friend had sent Sir Stafford a copy of this with the relevant passage marked. Sir Stafford was not taken aback. He read it with a delighted grin. It amused him very much to reflect how ludicrously far from the truth the journalists were on this occasion. His presence in Sophiagrad had been due entirely to a blameless interest in the rarer wild flowers, and to the urgencies of an elderly friend of his, Lady Lucy Cleghorn, who was indefatigable in her quest for these shy floral rarities, and who at any moment would scale a rock cliff or leap joyously into a bog at the sight of some floweret, the length of whose Latin name was in inverse proportion to its size. A small band of enthusiasts had been pursuing this botanical search on the slopes of mountains for about 10 days, when it occurred to Sir Stafford that it was a pity the paragraph was not true. He was just a little tired of wild flowers, and fond as he was of dear Lucy, her ability, despite her 60-odd years, to race up hills at top speed, easily outpacing him, sometimes annoyed him. Always just in front of him, he saw the seat of those bright royal blue trousers, and Lucy, though scraggy enough elsewhere, goodness knows, was decidedly too broad in the beam to wear royal blue corduroy trousers. A nice little international pie, he had thought, in which to dip his fingers, in which to play about. In the aeroplane, the metallic tannoy voice spoke again. It told the passengers that owing to heavy fog at Geneva, the plane would be diverted to Frankfurt airport and proceed from there to London. Passengers to Geneva would be rerouted from Frankfurt as soon as possible. It made no difference to Sir Stafford Nye. If there was fog in London, he supposed they would reroute the plane to Prestwick. He hoped that would not happen. He had been to Prestwick once or twice too often. Life, he thought, and journeys by air were really excessively boring. If only— he didn't know. If only— what? It was warm in the transit passenger lounge at Frankfurt, so Sir Stafford Nye slipped back his cloak, allowing its crimson lining to drape itself spectacularly round his shoulders. He was drinking a glass of beer and listening with half an ear to the various announcements as they were made. Flight 4387, flying to Moscow. Flight 2381, bound for Egypt and Calcutta. Journeys all over the globe. How romantic it ought to be. But there was something about the atmosphere of a passenger's lounge in an airport that chilled romance. It was too full of people, too full of things to buy, too full of similarly coloured seats, too full of plastic, too full of human beings, too full of crying children. He tried to remember who had said, "I wish I loved the human race, I wish I loved its silly face." Chesterton, perhaps? It was undoubtedly true. Put enough people together, and they looked so painfully alike that one could hardly bear it. An interesting face now, thought Sir Stafford. What a difference it would make. He looked disparagingly at two young women, splendidly made up, dressed in the national uniform of their country, England, he presumed, of shorter and shorter miniskirts, and another young woman, even better made up, in fact quite good-looking, who was wearing what he believed to be called a culotte suit. She had gone a little further along the road of fashion. He wasn't very interested in nice-looking girls who looked like all other nice-looking girls. He would like someone to be different. Someone sat down beside him, on the plastic-covered artificial leather settee on which he was sitting. Her face attracted his attention at once. Not precisely because it was different. In fact, he almost seemed to recognize it as a face he knew. Here was someone he had seen before. He couldn't remember where, or when it was, but it was certainly familiar. 25 or 6, he thought possibly as to age. A delicate, high-bridged aquiline nose, a black, heavy bush of hair reaching to her shoulders. She had a magazine in front of her, but she was not paying attention to it. She was, in fact, looking with something that was almost eagerness at him. Quite suddenly she spoke. It was a deep, contralto voice, almost as deep as a man's. It had a very faint foreign accent. She said, "Can I speak to you?" He studied her for a moment before replying. No, not what one might have thought. This wasn't a pick-up. This was something else. "I see no reason," he said, "why you should not do so. We have time to waste here, it seems." "Fog," said the woman. "Fog in Geneva, fog in London, perhaps. Fog everywhere. I don't know what to do." "Oh, you mustn't worry," he said reassuringly. "They'll land you somewhere all right. They're quite efficient, you know. Where are you going?" "I was going to Geneva." "Well, I expect you'll get there in the end." "I have to get there now. If I can get to Geneva, it will be all right. There is someone who will meet me there. I can be safe." Safe? He smiled a little. She said, "Safe is a four-letter word, but not the kind of four-letter word that people are interested in nowadays. And yet it can mean a lot. It means a lot to me." Then she said, "You see, if I can't get to Geneva, if I have to leave this plane here or go on in this plane to London with no arrangements made, I shall be killed." She looked at him sharply. "I suppose you don't believe that?" "I'm afraid I don't. It's quite true. People can be. They are every day." "Well, who wants to kill you?" "Does it matter?" "Not to me." "You can believe me if you wish to believe me. I am speaking the truth. I want help. Help to get to London safely." "And why should you select me to help you?" "Because I think that you know something about death. You have known of death. Perhaps seen death happen." He looked sharply at her, and then away again. "Any other reason?" he said. "Yes. This." She stretched out her narrow olive-skinned hand and touched the folds of the voluminous cloak. "This," she said. For the first time his interest was aroused. "No, what do you mean by that?" "It's unusual, characteristic. It is not what everyone wears." "True enough. It's one of my affectations, shall we say." "It's an affectation that could be useful to me." "What do you mean?" "I am asking you something. Probably you will refuse, but you might not refuse, because I think you are a man who is ready to take risks, just as I am a woman who takes risks." "I'll listen to your project," he said with a faint smile. "I want your cloak to wear. I want your passport. I want your boarding ticket for the plane. Presently, in 20 minutes or so, say, the flight for London will be called. I shall have your passport. I shall wear your cloak. And so I shall travel to London and arrive safely." "You mean you'll pass yourself off as me? My dear girl." She opened a handbag. From it she took a small square mirror. "Look there," she said. "Look at me, and then look at your own face." He saw what had been vaguely nagging at his mind. His sister, Pamela, who had died about 20 years ago. They had always been very alike, he and Pamela, a strong family resemblance. She had had a slightly masculine type of face. His face, perhaps, had been, certainly in early life, of a slightly effeminate type. They had both had the high, bridged nose, the tilt of the eyebrows, the slightly sideways smile of the lips. Pamela had been tall, 5'8", he himself 5'10". He looked at the woman who had tended him the mirror. "There is a facial likeness between us. And that's what you mean, isn't it? But, my dear girl, it wouldn't deceive anyone who knew me or knew you." "Of course it wouldn't. Don't you understand? It doesn't need to. I'm travelling wearing slacks. You have been travelling with the hood of your cloak drawn up round your face. All I have to do is cut off my hair, wrap it in a twist of newspaper, throw it in one of the litter baskets here. Then I put on your burnous. I have your boarding card, ticket and passport. Unless there is someone who knows you well on this plane, and I presume there is not, or they would have spoken to you already, then I can safely travel as you, showing your passport when it's necessary, keeping the burnous and cloak drawn up so that my nose and eyes and mouth are about all that are seen. I can walk out safely when the plane reaches its destination, because no one will know I have travelled by it. Walk out safely and disappear into the crowds of the City of London." "And what do I do?" asked Sir Stafford with a slight smile. "I can make a suggestion, if you have the nerve to face it." "Suggest," he said. "I always like to hear suggestions." "You get up from here. You go away and buy a magazine or a newspaper or a gift at the gift counter. You leave your cloak hanging here on the seat. When you come back with whatever it is, you sit down somewhere else, say at the end of that bench opposite here. There will be a glass in front of you, this glass still. In it there will be something that will send you to sleep. Sleep in a quiet corner. What happens next? You will have been, presumably, the victim of a robbery, she said. Somebody will have added a few knockout drops to your drink, and will have stolen your wallet from you. Something of that kind. You declare your identity, say that your passport and things are stolen. You can easily establish your identity. You know who I am? My name, I mean? Not yet, she said. I haven't seen your passport yet. I've no idea who you are. And yet, you say I can establish my identity easily. I am a good judge of people. I know who is important or who isn't. You are an important person. And why should I do all this? Perhaps to save the life of a fellow human being. Isn't that rather a highly coloured story? Oh, yes. Quite easily not believed. Do you believe it? He looked at her thoughtfully. You know what you're talking like. A beautiful spy in a thriller. Yes, perhaps. But I am not beautiful. And you're not a spy. I might be so described, perhaps. I have certain information. Information I want to preserve. You will have to take my word for it. It is information that would be valuable to your country. Don't you think you're being rather absurd? Yes, I do. If this was written down, it would look absurd. But so many absurd things are true, aren't they? He looked at her again. She was very like Pamela. Her voice, although foreign in intonation, was like Pamela's. What she proposed was ridiculous, absurd, quite impossible, and probably dangerous to him. Unfortunately, though, that was what attracted him. To have the nerve to suggest such a thing to him. What would come of it all? It would be interesting, certainly, to find out. What do I get out of it? He said. That's what I'd like to know. She looked at him consideringly. Diversion, she said. Something out of the everyday happenings. An antidote to boredom, perhaps. We've not got very long. It's up to you. And what happens to your passport? Do I have to buy myself a wig, if they sell such a thing at the counter? Do I have to impersonate a female? No. There's no question of exchanging places. You have been robbed and drugged, but you remain yourself. Make up your mind, there isn't long. Time is passing very quickly. I have to do my own transformation. You win, he said. One mustn't refuse the unusual if it's offered to one. I hoped you might feel that way, but it was a toss-up. From his pocket, Stafford Nye took out his passport. He slipped it into the outer pocket of the cloak he had been wearing. He rose to his feet, yawned, looked round him, looked at his watch, and strolled over to the counter where various goods were displayed for sale. He did not even look back. He bought a paperback book and fingered some small woolly animals, a suitable gift for some child. Finally, he chose a panda. He looked round the lounge, came back to where he had been sitting. The cloak was gone. And so was the girl. A half-glass of beer was still on the table. Here, he thought, is where I take the risk. He picked up the glass, moved away a little, and drank it, not quickly, quite slowly. It tasted much the same as it had tasted before. "Now, I wonder," said Sir Stafford. "Now, I wonder." He walked across the lounge to a far corner. There was a somewhat noisy family sitting there, laughing and talking together. He sat down near them, yawned, let his head fall back on the edge of a cushion. A flight was announced leaving for Tehran. A large number of passengers got up and went to queue by the requisite numbered gate. The lounge still remained half full. He opened his paperback book. He yawned again. He was really sleepy now. Yes, he was very sleepy. He must just think out where it was best for him to go off to sleep. Somewhere he could remain. Trans-European Airways announced the departure of their plane Flight 309 for London. Quite a good sprinkling of passengers rose to their feet to obey the summons. By this time, though, more passengers had entered the transit lounge, waiting for other planes. Announcements followed as to fog at Geneva and other disabilities of travel. A slim man of middle height, wearing a dark blue cloak with its red lining showing, and with a hood drawn up over a close-cropped head, not noticeably more untidy than many of the heads of young men nowadays, walked across the floor to take his place in the queue for the plane. Showing a boarding ticket, he passed out through gate number 9. More announcements followed. Swissair flying to Zurich, BEA to Athens and Cyprus. And then a different type of announcement. Will Miss Daphne Theodophanes, passenger to Geneva, kindly come to the flight desk. Plane to Geneva is delayed owing to fog. Passengers will travel by way of Athens. The aeroplane is now ready to leave. Other announcements followed dealing with passengers to Japan, to Egypt, to South Africa, airlines spanning the world. Mr. Sidney Cook, passenger to South Africa, was urged to come to the flight desk, where there was a message for him. Daphne Theodophanes was called for again. This is the last call before the departure of Flight 309. In a corner of the lounge, a little girl was looking up at a man in a dark suit who was fast asleep, his head resting against the cushion of the red settee. In his hand he held a small, woolly panda. The little girl's hand stretched out towards the panda. Her mother said, "Now, Joan, don't touch that. The poor gentleman's asleep." "Where is he going?" "Perhaps he's going to Australia too," said the mother, "like we are." "Has he got a little girl like me?" "I think he must have," said her mother. The little girl sighed and looked at the panda again. Sir Stafford Nye continued to sleep. He was dreaming that he was trying to shoot a leopard. "A very dangerous animal," he was saying to the safari guide who was accompanying him. "A very dangerous animal, so I've always heard. You can't trust a leopard." The dream switched at that moment, as dreams have a habit of doing, and he was having tea with his great-aunt Matilda, and trying to make her hear. She was deafer than ever. He had not heard any of the announcements, except for the first one, for Miss Daphne Theodophanes. The little girl's mother said, "I've always wondered, you know, about a passenger that's missing. Nearly always, whenever you go anywhere by air, you hear it. Somebody they can't find. Somebody who hasn't heard the call, or isn't on the plane, or something like that. I always wonder who it is, and what they're doing, and why they haven't come. I suppose this Miss What's-her-name, or whatever it is, will just have missed her plane. What will they do with her then?" Nobody was able to answer her question, because nobody had the proper information. Chapter 2. London. Sir Stafford Nye's flat was a very pleasant one. It looked out upon Green Park. He switched on the coffee percolator and went to see what the post had left him this morning. It did not appear to have left him anything very interesting. He sorted through the letters, a bill or two, a receipt, and letters with rather uninteresting postmarks. He shuffled them together and placed them on the table, where some mail was already lying, accumulating from the last 2 days. He'd have to get down to things soon, he supposed. His secretary would be coming in some time or other this afternoon. He went back to the kitchen, poured coffee into a cup, and brought it to the table. He picked up the 2 or 3 letters that he had opened late last night when he arrived. One of them he referred to, and smiled a little as he read it. 11:30, he said. "Quite a suitable time. I wonder now. I expect I'd better just think things over and get prepared for Chetwynd." Somebody pushed something through the letterbox. He went out into the hall and got the morning paper. There was very little news in the paper. A political crisis, an item of foreign news which might have been disquieting, but he didn't think it was. It was merely a journalist letting off steam and trying to make things rather more important than they were. Must give the people something to read. A girl had been strangled in the park. Girls were always being strangled. One a day, he thought callously. No child had been kidnapped or raped this morning. That was a nice surprise. He made himself a piece of toast and drank his coffee. Later, he went out of the building, down into the street, and walked through the park in the direction of Whitehall. He was smiling to himself. Life, he felt, was rather good this morning. He began to think about Chetwynd, Chetwynd was a silly fool, if ever there was one. A good facade, important seeming, and a nicely suspicious mind. He'd rather enjoy talking to Chetwynd. He reached Whitehall a comfortable 7 minutes late. That was only due to his own importance compared with that of Chetwynd, he thought. He walked into the room. Chetwynd was sitting behind his desk and had a lot of papers on it, and a secretary there. He was looking properly important, as he always did, when he could make it. "Hello, Nye," said Chetwynd, smiling all over his impressively handsome face. "Glad to be back. How is Malaya?" "Hot," said Stafford Nye. "Yes, well, I suppose it always is. You meant atmospherically, I suppose, not politically." "Oh, purely atmospherically," said Stafford Nye. He accepted a cigarette and sat down. "Got any results to speak of?" "Oh, hardly. Not what you'd call results. I've sent in my report. All a lot of talky as usual." "How's Lazenby?" "Oh, a nuisance, as he always is. He'll never change," said Chetwynd. "No, that would seem too much to hope for." "I haven't served on anything with Bascom before. He can be quite fun when he likes." "Can he? I don't know very well. Yes, I suppose he can." "Well. No other news, I suppose?" "No, nothing. Nothing, I think, that would interest you." "You didn't mention in your letter quite why you wanted to see me." "Oh, just to go over a few things, that's all. You know, in case you'd brought any special dope home with you. Anything we ought to be prepared for, you know. Questions in the house, anything like that." "Yes, of course." "Came home by air, didn't you? Had a bit of trouble, I gather." Stafford Nye put on the face that he had been determined to put on beforehand. It was slightly rueful, with a faint tinge of annoyance. "Oh, so you heard about that, did you?" he said. "Silly business." Yes, must have been." "Extraordinary," said Stafford Nye, "how things always get into the press. There was a paragraph in the stop press this morning." "You'd rather they wouldn't have, I suppose." "Well, makes me look a bit of an ass, doesn't it?" said Stafford Nye. "Got to admit it. At my age, too." "What happened exactly? I wondered if the report in the paper had been exaggerating." "Well, I suppose they made the most of it, that's all. You know what these journeys are, damn boring. There was fog at Geneva, so they had to reroute the plane. Then there was 2 hours' delay at Frankfurt." "Is that when it happened?" "Yes, one's bored stiff in these airports. Planes coming, planes going, tannoy going full steam ahead. Flight 302, leaving for Hong Kong, Flight 109, going to Ireland, this, that, and the other, people getting up, people leaving, and you just sit there yawning." "What happened exactly?" said Chetwynd. "Well, I'd got a drink in front of me, Pilsner, as a matter of fact, and I thought I'd got to get something else to read. I'd read everything I'd got with me, so I went over to the counter, bought some wretched paperback or other. Detective story, I think it was, and I bought a woolly animal for one of my nieces. Then I came back, finished my drink, opened my paperback, and then I went to sleep." "Yes. I see, you went to sleep. Well, a very natural thing to do, isn't it? I suppose they called my flight, but if they did, I didn't hear it. I didn't hear it apparently for the best of reasons. I'm capable of going to sleep in an airport any time, but I'm also capable of hearing an announcement that concerns me. Well, this time I didn't. When I woke up, or came to, however you like to put it, I was having a bit of medical attention. Somebody apparently had dropped a Mickey Finn or something or other in my drink. Must have done it when I was away getting the paperback." "Rather an extraordinary thing to happen, wasn't it?" said Chetwynd. "Well, it's never happened to me before," said Stafford Nye. "I hope it will never again. It makes you feel an awful fool, you know, besides having a hangover. There was a doctor and some nurse creature or something. Anyway, there was no great harm done, apparently. My wallet had been pinched, with some money in it and my passport. It was awkward, of course. Fortunately, I hadn't got much money. My traveller's checks were in an inner pocket. There always has to be a bit of red tape and all that if you lose your passport. Anyway, I had letters and things, and identification was not difficult. And in due course things were squared up, and I resumed my flight. Still very annoying for you," said Chetwynd.